Remember what the president of the European Council said, that Europe is like a beautiful garden, but it's surrounded by a jungle, and the jungle is trying to invade it, and we, the gardeners, must prune it, and we must stop it. This is the same narrative as that of the fascists and the Nazis of the 1920s and 30s, and we know where it ends up. Military Keynesianism does not work, unless you have one war after the other to keep the machine fed. At some point, either you're going to stop the wars and then the whole economic miracle is going to collapse, or you're going to be embroiled in a world war, in a genocide, in some regional conflict that in the end turns your own country into a wasteland. So in the name of purifying the nation is led down the garden path.
With some guests here on Downstream, you're guaranteed to have a hit. You're guaranteed to get a ton of views on YouTube, viral clips on social media. You're guaranteed to have a fascinating conversation. Why? Because of their personality, because they've got a ton of interesting things to say, because they're original thinkers. Today's guest meets all of those metrics. They are, without doubt, one of the most interesting intellectuals in Europe today. They also happen to be very left-wing. We've spoken to them a few times before, particularly about things like techno-feudalism, current affairs, politics, what's going on in the world. But their latest book is a memoir, Raise Your Soul, A Personal History of Resistance. It looks at 5 women in the life of this week's guest. And that guest is, of course, the one only Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister in Greece. Yanis, nice to have you back on Downstream.
It's great to be back.
It's great to have you back. I think this is, a third, fourth time?
Let's not count.
Let's not count.
Let's keep going. Let's never stop.
Every time is a pleasure. We're talking about your new book, Raise Your Soul, A Personal History of Resistance. It's very different to what you've previously written.
Very, very different.
Very different.
Indeed.
You've written sort of first-person narratives of political events in real time, like the post-2015 context. But this is basically not just your life story. Well, it's not really your life story at all, actually. It's the story of multiple family members.
It's actually 5 women.
5 women.
The intended subtitle, until the good people in Penguin stepped in and ruled it out, the intended subtitle was 5 women who taught me how to fight fascism, authoritarianism, and the male chauvinist within. Now, you can imagine why Penguin didn't like it. It was too long. But that's what really this book is about. It's about these 5 women. Through them, I tell a story of 100 years, from 1923, 101 years to 2024. So it's a memoir that is trying to put on center stage those 5 women that, well, truly shaped me.
The stories are refracted through these 5 women. We'll go to those in a minute. But it does also encompass the story of your dad, your uncle, the Greek diaspora before World War II. I mean, it really is
the British Empire.
Big picture stuff.
Nazi occupation, Winston Churchill's civil war in Greece, then my time in Britain. So, I try to tell my story through the eyes of 5 women because, when you try to see as a man the world through the eyes of women, then you have a better chance of understanding your own circumstances.
So who are the 5 women, quickly?
Well, very quickly, the first chapter is my mum, Eleni, and it begins with her taking me, when I was only 9 or so, to see her brother, who was in prison, recently tortured, during the dictatorship, the right-wing fascist dictatorship in Greece. So through her, I introduced the reader to my politicization, because my mother was my political mentor. I mean, I spent 26 years abroad, out of Greece. And every day I would call her to talk politics, nothing else. No family matters, no how are you, what have you been doing, politics. So the second chapter then moves back to the past, to 1923, when my father's mum exits an orphanage, a Catholic nunnery kind of school, in Cairo, Egypt. And she makes herself effectively an adult. She creates adulthood by joining the so-called Egyptian Feminist Union in 1923. And so it's a story of resistance from her perspective. Then she begets my dad. So at the end of chapter 2, my mom and dad meet. So this is how the story proceeds. Then the third chapter is my mother's mother, who raised me, a peasant girl from the Peloponnese, who only learned how to read and write Greek in her 60s. And through her eyes, I narrate the manner in which I came into being effectively as a teenager and eventually left for these shores, for the United Kingdom in 1978. And then the fourth chapter is my daughter's great-grandmother, who is the epitome of a kind of novel that would resemble what Tolstoy would write if he was to narrate the Greek Civil War and everything that followed. And that allows me to bring back elements from the 1940s, connect them to my life in Britain, then in Australia, my understanding of the end of the Cold War. And then the final chapter is my better half than I, an artist, whose eyes allow me, and hopefully the reader, to look at the last 20 years.
It's really similar to Leah Erpi, which is quite strange because we were speaking to Leah. She's obviously Albanian.
Yes.
Her grandmother.
It's quite similar, actually.
Very similar. Her story, her grandmother's story, is fascinating. She was born in Salonika when it had just been given to the Greeks, the Kingdom of Greece, previously part of the Ottoman Empire. They were an Albanian family. They spoke Albanian. They'd never been to Albania. And all of a sudden, because of these big historical events, they were told, actually, you're Albanian. You should probably go there.
It is a great book.
It's a great book.
And it is it's the same locus, the Balkan Peninsula, ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
There is an element of that in the third chapter, in which I tell the story of my mother's mother, whose village, I always knew it as Rhododaphne, Greek name, and on her deathbed, when she was in and out of a coma, she said her last wish was that I would take her, if she ever got out of hospital, to her village, Service. And I said, your village is not Service, it's Rhododaphne. No, that's a bullshit name. Effectively, there was ethnic cleansing. Service means the Serbs. So, the Balkan Peninsula was a cauldron. It was the Greeks, the Albanians, the Serbs, the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, and so on and so forth. And then the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of nation-states, as in the rest of Europe, created forces that led to ethnic cleansing, to the rewriting of history, to new forms of exploitation, new forms of antagonism, which you can see in Palestine how easy it is to lead to bloodshed and genocide.
And as an appendage to that, the book towards the start has this story of your grandmother in Cairo.
That's right. That's chapter 2.
Chapter 2, and there's this extraordinarily an ancient Greek community in Egypt, which is there for millennia, and they mostly go after 1945. What happens there? Because, the way that she seems to interpret their presence in Egypt is one of exploitation and oppression. But I read that story, I read Leah Erpi's story, and it feels like that was a lost modernity. That was a different kind of world that we decided not to pursue, one of cosmopolitanism and so on.
I tried to tell the story of how she discovered that history of the lost modernity and colonization. You mentioned that the Greeks had been there since Alexander the Great moved. I mean, Cleopatra was a Greek Macedonian. Great scholars, the Alexandria Library, the greatest library in the world, mythical and epic in its size and importance. All that was part of the Greek community in Egypt. And that community intermingled with the Arabs in centuries that followed, and actually they lived in great harmony for many centuries until colonization, European colonization, sets in the 1870s. Britain takes over Egypt through indebtedness. I don't know whether you want the details, but
please.
All right. What happened was the French built the Suez Canal. The British Empire didn't like it because the British Empire controlled the Silk Road, the international trade routes overland. And the Suez Canal, which was French, was a competitor. So London wanted to grab it. And the way they managed to grab it is typical and very smart. Effectively, they indebted the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government, from the 1830s to the 1870s, was investing heavily in industry, in culture. There was a university hospital, a university medical training center in the 1830s, 1840s, producing women doctors. And, women, progressive British women, Italian women, French women were going to Cairo to study medicine and to become doctoresses. So, there was a modernity. But in the 1870s, this process of lending money to the Egyptian government to fund quite a bit of that, investment, following a banking crisis in the United States after the railways collapsed, another 1929 or 2008, if you want, in Wall Street, that led to the bankruptcy of the Egyptian state, and the British moved in and took the place over. It was their collateral, essentially. They used the army as well. They fought a battle against the Egyptians and occupied them, and then erased the history of Egyptian modernity. And with it, they erased the history of the emancipation of Egyptian women, following the creation of those schools producing doctoresses and so on, as well as the Egyptian Feminist Union, which I discovered very recently as I was researching this book, that my grandmother, Anna, had joined in 1923. So she was a card-carrying member of something called the Egyptian Feminist Union, which was made of Egyptian Muslim women. Today, here in the West, there is this depiction of countries like Egypt, of Syria, of Palestine, of Iraq, as backward places where fundamentalism reigns supreme. That's not the case. You only need to do a little bit of research to find out that this was a figment of the Western imagination, and it was functional, this figment. It was functional to the interests of the colonial rulers of places like Egypt. It was run totally exploitatively. And the Greek community that had been there for yonks was fused into the British ruling class. So my family Anna's husband, my grandfather, was the director of Thomas Cook in Cairo, and he was organizing Death on the Nile cruises for British aristocrats. And so essentially my father grew up in a family made of the director of Thomas Cook and this crypto-feminist revolutionary. Her husband didn't know that she was organizing strikes for women in textile factories, right? But that family belonged to the ruling class, which was a British, French, Italian, Greek, Jewish, expat ruling class. And the Egyptians were effectively an enslaved community. There's a lot to unpick there, and a lot that informs us today about the very warped view we have of what is the Middle East, of what European civilization means, if there is such a thing, because we were pretty uncivilized, when you look at the manner in which we betrayed our own values of the Enlightenment and modernity wherever we ruled.
I suppose a skeptic, and cards on table, I agree with all of that, right? But I suppose a skeptic would say, Yanis, this is typical leftist cope. The reality is that Greeks left, and yes, I buy the argument that they had been integrated into British-led sort of bourgeois bloc. But the Greeks left because of Arab nationalism, even though the Greeks of Egypt had been there longer than the Arabs had. The Greeks left that part of the world for the same reason that Jews left Baghdad, right? You get the emergence, again, you might agree or disagree. You might think it's in response to the formation of the State of Israel, etc., the breakdown of European colonialism, but it happened. And you have Arab nationalism, and that wants increasingly homogenous states. It can't really deal with the sort of diversity and multiplicity of minorities like Greeks. What would you say to that? Because it is fair, and it's what happened to your grandfather, sorry. They do leave pretty sharpish after the Second World War. And there's not really an effort to keep them there.
The argument that you presented,
Yeah.
which I know you don't believe in, but it's an important argument to deconstruct, is a very powerful one, except that it is half right and half wrong, which means that it is misleading. So it is true. I mean, historically speaking, you have the Nasser revolution, you have the Egyptians taking back their country, essentially uprooting the British colonial regime, getting rid of them, and then the Greeks leave very shortly afterwards, not very short, within a decade of that, slowly and then much faster rates of emigration.
Gradually and then all at once, as Hemingway
Yes,
said.
indeed, as these things happen. This is true, but it's not because they were thrown out. It's because, take my grandfather. My grandfather and I had conversations about that, even though I was quite young. I still have a vivid memory of him explaining to me. He said, look, we were the ruling class. And we had a fantastic life. We lived better in Egypt as the ruling class of that country than the bourgeoisie lived in London or in Paris. Much better. You know, they had first-class travel to the pyramids and trips on the Nile, and they had servants, you know, from the Egyptian population who were quasi-enslaved. They lived really very well. So when the revolution takes place and the Arabs, the Egyptians, reclaim their country, then the possibility of continuing to live in such affluence, which was the result of the exploitation of the local population, these capacities disappear. And a lot of them left as a result of not being able to be exploiting the local population. Now, the fact that the Nasser revolution ended up in tears, and like many European revolutions, ended up devouring its children, right? Let's not forget what happened here, what's happened in the French Revolution. Every time there is a revolution, usually it ends in, even though it may have very good long-term historical dynamic effects, in the end, it ends up in tears. So even though that is the case, my father and even my grandfather appreciated the fact that it couldn't continue, that the locals had to take back their land. And by the way, when you say Arab nationalism, you have to understand that a lot of them were Christian. It's not the Muslim versus Christian story. And secondly, that who are the Arabs and who are the descendants of the original Egyptians? They were utterly intermingled. In the same way that, and this is a tragedy, that a lot of the people who are being massacred now in Gaza or in ethnically cleansed in East Jerusalem or the West Bank, if you go back many centuries, they were part of exactly the same Jewish population that in the end were Islamicized or Christianized, and who essentially, they're a Semitic nation. They're two Semitic nations that should be living side by side. And in the end, you've got this genocide of one part of a Semitic nation by another.
When we came up with the idea of Downstream, it was about having the most important conversations with the most interesting people out there. But there is simply too much to condense into the video that you see on YouTube. We have conversations before and after, and we want to make sure you get all that juicy info as well. That's why we're starting a new Downstream newsletter encapsulating some of those conversations, anecdotes, even suggested reading material. If you'd like to subscribe to that newsletter, and yes, you need another newsletter in your life, I promise, go to novara.media/Downstream newsletter. It is going to be packed with really great information landing in your inbox every week. I think what makes the Greek experience in Egypt really interesting and different and makes one ask distinctive questions is that the experience you're talking about of Greeks in Egypt right until 1945, it feels like for a British sort of mind, like settler colonialists in, Rhodesia or even maybe South Africa, not quite as bad as that perhaps, but that kind of experience, Kenya. But the point is they had been there longer than the very people who viewed them as outsiders. And that's what I think is really, really fascinating with
It's
that.
not exactly so. from the figures I have looked at, I've studied, there were around 100,000 Greeks in Egypt. Of them,
And most of them in Cairo, I presume, in
Cairo
Alexandria.
and Alexandria.
Yeah.
Lots of them in Alexandria, some in Port Said, but mainly there. And I would say that of them, 10,000 were the descendants from ancient times.
Interesting.
90,000 moved in, especially after the 1922 war between Greece and Turkey, what we Greeks refer to as the Asia Minor catastrophe, when millions of ethnic Greeks were ethnically cleansed following the clash between the Greek and Turkish armies in 1922. A lot of them moved there. Between 1922 and 1932, they moved everywhere. They moved to the United States, they moved to Canada, they moved to Australia. You still find ethnic Greeks from Turkey in all sorts of places around the world, and Egypt was one of them. So in that sense, they are quite similar to the Greeks who went to South Africa to be part of the apartheid regime, of the colonial British Boer regime, and they played a role in setting up apartheid, a regressive role, while it must be said, some of them, like my grandmother, chapter 2, Anna, saw the injustice, saw the exploitation of the locals, and joined them. So in South Africa, you have George Bezos, one of the sons of the migrants to South Africa, who ended up being Nelson Mandela's lawyer, and he ended up scripting most of the fantastic new, fresh South African constitution. So Anna was part of this community that was fused into the expat community that were the ruling class and the exploiters of the Egyptians, but she had, in a clandestine manner, joined the underground resistance against her own class and her own people.
And what was the Asia Minor catastrophe?
Well, that's when, following the Great War, the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and bits and pieces of it were up for grabs. One prized part of the old Ottoman Empire, from the Greek perspective, was the Aegean coast around Smyrna, as we call it in Greece, because that was the vast majority of people there were ethnic Greeks from the ancient times. Homer was born there. That coast, what is now Turkey, the Aegean coast, was part of the Greek civilization. And there were still pockets, including Smyrna, that were majority ethnic Greeks. So the Greek government, under Venizelos, who is mentioned in this book, utilized his great alliance with the British and good relationship with the French to get them after in the Versailles Treaty, during the period following the First World War, to agree to take a chunk with Smyrna around it from the Turkish coast of the Aegean and give it to the Greek state. So the Greek army disembarks in Smyrna, takes a large part of land around Smyrna with the approval of the great powers. Then that the government that achieves that diplomatic victory for Greece falls in an election, an ultra-nationalist government comes in. They decide to take more chunks of land from the Turks, and that's when Mustafa Kemal, later known as Kemal Atatürk, who revived modern Turkey, he's the father of the modern Turkish nation, saw it as a great opportunity to drum up support amongst the Turks, get the Greeks. And get the Greeks he did. There were battles, the Turkish army won, and threw the Greeks into the sea, which was a complete tragedy for the ethnic Greeks who were there since the times of Homer, because 5 million of them ended up being boat people. And many of them went, of course, to Greece, others went to the United States. The reason why we have more than 1.5 million Greeks in the United States is the Asia Minor catastrophe.
Isn't that crazy? And also, it's interesting, I didn't know that. So you were talking about the Treaty of Sèvres there, which is 1920, which awards Smyrna to the Kingdom of Greece. And then, of course, is it Sèvres 20? And then it's reversed in 23?
Yes, because after the catastrophe.
Yeah.
Then there was a treaty which effectively sealed the victory of Turkey
and
over the
that's
Greeks.
The Treaty of Lausanne?
This is the Treaty of Lausanne, followed by the Treaty of Lausanne, exactly. And there was another treaty in Geneva. But this was a catastrophic treaty.
I mean, 5 million people, man.
Because you know what happened was, after the Greeks lost, after we lost that part of the Turkish coast in battle, the two governments agreed to trade populations. That was such a heart-wrenching event, because there were thousands and thousands of Turks, ethnic Turks, in Crete, in Athens, around Athens, in Macedonia, Greek Macedonia, in the Peloponnese. And they were forcefully removed and sent to Turkey, to a country they've never been to for centuries. Whereas the ethnic Greeks from northern Turkey, Trabzon and other places, as well as Smyrna, 5 million were moved. The ones who did not escape the Turkish army, then they were forcefully moved to Greece, to a place they had never been to ever, because these were ethnic Greeks that knew Asia Minor as their home, even in ancient Greek times. And in a sense, that was good for Greece, because before that, we were a basket case of a country. And all these people were far more sophisticated than the original inhabitants of Greece, who were far more agricultural and backward. Whereas the ethnic Greeks that were forced to come to Greece after 1923 were, they were richer, they were more cultivated, better educated. For God's sake, they had an opera in Smyrna. So modern Greece owes a lot to these people, but still the pain of being forcefully removed from your land is still there, still in Greek music. If you hear sorrowful Greek bouzouki songs, some of them pretty good, resembling a little bit of the jazz and blues of the Deep South in the United States, it's because of the sorrow of having been forcefully removed from the land, exactly the same as black music in the United States.
And the really interesting thing is that all of this is done under international law. We view our international treaties, we view international law as this thing that will guarantee human rights, liberty, and freedoms, but actually it's underpinned this extraordinary thing of, like you say, transporting millions of people from one country to another. In response, one country sends millions back the other way. Also, you said about all of this being the result of overreach by an ultranationalist government, which I didn't know. I mean, there's a pattern, isn't there? The ultranationalist far-right governments, they get something, look
in
at...
the name of patriotism, they do a lot of damage to our motherland, fatherland, our lands.
Yeah, they have a tendency to overreach, right?
Same in 1974. You may have heard of the invasion of Turkey that effectively sliced a chunk of Cyprus and caused another exchange of populations, another heart-wrenching removal of Turkish Cypriots from the south to the north, and of course of the majority of the Greek Cypriots, all of the Cypriots from the north to the south. That was another such incident. This was 1974. This was in my lifetime, and this happened because, I'm in danger of being denounced here by my fellow Greeks for not taking fully the Greek side. But I have to say that this is a historical fact. That there were lots of tensions. There was. The United States was planning to divide the island of Cyprus between Greece and Turkey, because you see the island of Cyprus was neutral and did not want to become a military base for the United States in the 1960s, while the Arab-Israeli war was hotting up. But the excuse for the invasion was given to Ankara, to the Turkish government, by the fascist regime that I describe vividly in chapters 2 and 3, because they overthrew the democratically elected Greek president, Makarios, in order to install a fascist dictatorship that was virulently xenophobic and anti-Turkish. And 18% of the population were Turks. So Turkey used this as an excuse to protect its own ethnic Turks, to invade Cyprus. So yet again, an overreaching fascist right-wing Greek government did a lot to damage, the Greek nation, to put it in simple nationalistic terms.
Do you think that's a feature of the far right? So right now, for instance, you've got the ultranationalist right across Europe on the rise, in America on the rise. And then you see these accounts online and they're saying, what we really want is basically repatriation of every non-white person in this country to go back to X, Y, Z. And that just strikes me as implausible. It won't happen. It literally can't happen, because in somewhere like the United States or the UK, I mean, this is just ridiculous, frankly. How would you even measure that? Would it include Irish people? Would it be 1/8 something else? David Beckham's grandparent is Jewish. Where would it end? This is the first thing. But there does seem to be this tendency of just complete overreach, which means that even when they make initial political gains, it ends in disaster. Do you know the band Laibach? You must do, right? Life is Life. It's a great song. I know people should listen to this song. It's on YouTube or whatever. And it starts, and it's militaristic, and it's fervent and patriotic, and it's all grand sounding. You're making history, you're living life. And then at the end, it's same tone, same register, and they're saying, everybody died, we failed, we screwed up, it was a catastrophe. And I wonder, is there something inherent there to far-right politics?
Of course. I look at what impact Hitler had on the German nation.
Yeah.
Decimated the Germans.
Yeah.
Absolutely decimated the Germans. Every right-wing fascist, Nazi, proto-fascist regime, in the name of the motherland, does a lot of damage to the motherland. This is standard. I mean, look at Pinochet in Chile. Chile has not recovered from that experience, and I don't think.
How so? Somebody would say that Chile's the wealthiest country per capita in South America. Surely, that's because of Pinochet, even if he did disgusting, murderous things. Why is it not recovered?
Well, firstly, the majority of people are worse off today than they were 30 years ago. If you look at their capacity to educate their children, to house themselves, to put food on the table. GDP per capita is perhaps the most disconcerting and misleading measure of well-being. Let me put it, Aaron, in another way. I mean, you know it and we know it, but let's just make sure that everybody understands it. So if we're all in a pub and Mark Zuckerberg walks in, we are all, per capita terms, billionaires. All of us, billionaires, not millionaires. We're not. It's a joke. What happened was the copper mines, extremely lucrative copper mines, were privatized. And a tiny band of Chileans became extremely rich. And also, wages were crashed because of the policies of crashing trade unions. So profit rates, even for medium-sized businesses, went up. But the vast majority, 70%, 80% of the people in Chile are far worse off. And now politics is completely paralyzed. And you have congresses and presidents who, independently of their intentions, whether they're good or bad, sometimes they're not bad, they have decent intentions, they're simply paralyzed. They simply cannot govern Chile in a way that they move out of that downward spiral. Same with Greece today. So, but more generally speaking, you mentioned this idea of purifying the nation. Getting rid of the riffraff, getting rid of the other, the brown, the Jew, the Muslim, the people who somehow sully the DNA of the nation. And that's a standard Nazi fascist trope. The idea is that our pure men and women would have done wonders in this country if they were not held behind by all these impurities that have infiltrated the body of the nation. And that if somehow we manage to purify the body of the nation, which will, unfortunately, they say, but they don't mean it, involve strengthening our defenses in order to keep our borders airtight, and that may involve the occasional war with the riffraff out there, the foreigners who are trying to undermine our sovereignty and so on. So this whole narrative may begin beautifully in terms of GDP, especially GDP per capita. If you have military Keynesianism, if you spend a lot of money on the police, on armies and weaponry and so on. This is exactly what happened in the 1920s in Italy and 1930s in Germany. This is what the European Union is trying to do now with military Keynesianism, of embarking upon a spending spree on weaponry, which is also underpinned by Islamophobia, by the fear of the Chinese, of the Russian, of the African. Remember what the president of the European Council said, that Europe is like a beautiful garden, but it's surrounded by a jungle, and the jungle is trying to invade it, and we, the gardeners, must prune it, and we must stop. This is the same narrative as that of the fascists and the Nazis of the 1920s and 30s, and we know where it ends up. Military Keynesianism does not work, unless you have one war after the other to keep the machine fed. At some point, either you are going to stop the wars and then the whole economic miracle is going to collapse, or you're going to be embroiled in a world war, in a genocide, in some regional conflict that in the end turns your own country into a wasteland. So in the name of purifying the nation is led down the garden path.
I can't imagine a more stupid position than being a German fascist. If you were a German nationalist, if you were a German ultra-nationalist, why would you want to pursue that politics? Because you look at Germany's fundamentals at the start of the 20th century, its scientific base is just wild. You know, your background is science, your parents were scientists. I mean, Christ, it's just they had a virtual monopoly on the world's leading theoretical scientists. You look at the innovations coming out of that country, its population growth, its cultural production. The 20th century could have been the German century. It should have been the German century, but they fucked up twice really badly. And the second one was particularly fucked up because, you know, look at Berlin in 1945 at the end of it, and your country gets partitioned. And I find it remarkable that even given that, you lost the 20th century, you lost the possibility of being, you know, this extraordinary great cultural political power, and you still go, oh, you know, old Adolf, the Austrian painter.
The Austrian painter. Second-rate painter, third-rate painter. Aaron, I think there is a missing link in your narrative. I agree with everything you said. The missing link is capitalism. Because you see, if you combine a lot of capital goods, machinery, science, engineering, physics, you put it all together, you end up with a great deal of potential, which you described beautifully. A potential to do great things, to be a great country on the cusp of scientific revolutions, of production, and so on and so forth. But when those machines are owned by a tiny percentage of the population, and their accumulated profits hinge on the exploitation of the many, then that introduces the poison, which, let me put it very succinctly if I can, you end up being able to produce a lot more stuff than the majority of the people who are producing it in the factories can consume, because you have squeezed the living daylights out of them in order to have high profit rates and price cost margins for the very few. And then you have a dearth in demand. That's when Keynes comes in. So you have a slump. Then you have unemployment. That gives rise to discontent. Then some third-rate painter from Austria gets up on a soapbox and says, I know who the problem is. It's the Jew, or the Islamist, or, you know, the foreigner, or the Irish. It doesn't matter, right? Somebody, you know, the left-handed, the trans, the gay, whoever that can be identifiable and who can become the focal point of the discontent, which is as the result of the failure of capitalist labor and capital markets. Okay? And then you get a lot of strength from them, and you say, I'm going to make you great again. I'm going to make you proud again. Just give me absolute authority, and I will look after you, and I'm going to go and get the Jew, the Islamist, the Frenchman, the Greek, whatever, yeah? The British. And then you get a lot of power, and at the beginning, you can take this power, like Hitler did, and you can throw a lot of money at industry to build up weaponry. And that creates employment. And then people love you because they were unemployed and now they are not unemployed anymore. And they feel really very proud because they see a lot of tanks rolling out of the production line. And they have parades. And you build an Olympic stadium and you stage the Olympics. And you have Riefenstahl creating beautiful film of the re-emergent, national, proud, species. And then at some point you invade Poland. But that, this is what happened in the 1930s in Germany. It's They are now attempting to do it again. When Trump says "Make America great again," I mean, when was America great ever? It never was great.
I suppose
Never.
I suppose a skeptic of that would say,
When they had slaves,
no, they would just
when
say
they had a civil war,
before it deindustrialized. That's what they would say. Before we deindustrialized, that's what they would say.
But that's when they had slaves
No,
in the cotton fields.
before.
Yeah, and they killed all the natives.
But I'm just trying to. Again, I'm trying to.
When was that? When was the greatness of the United States realized?
I think that Trump's arguments that register the most. Forget the culture war stuff. Forget Sydney Sweeney and adverts. Like literally nobody cares about that stuff. The stuff that I think is agreed on by JD Vance, all the way down to a Trump voter in the Appalachian Mountains who barely consumes news content. They agree on two things: illegal migration and deindustrialization. They agree on that. So, okay, park the illegal migration thing. I think when they say make the country great again, I do genuinely think they mean before deindustrialization, which we agree that's a natural feature of capitalist production.
Well, it's actually
profiteering.
Deindustrialization was a catastrophe for the American working class. There's no doubt about it. It could have to do with immigration. Nothing to do with immigration. I mean,
sure,
the United States is the result of migration. It doesn't matter whether it's illegal or legal. I mean, in my country, we had migration of half of Albania. It was all illegal in the 1990s, and it created a much better Greece as a result. I mean, my university students, most of them now are children of those Albanian migrants. Without them, we wouldn't have a university. They are the best students I've ever had. So, it doesn't, this illegal thing. Migration is part and parcel of the American story. Where you're absolutely right, and where Trump is absolutely right, is that deindustrialization was a disaster for the majority of Americans. You go from coast to coast, and all you see is carnage. The word that he used in his inauguration speech in 2016, which was a horrible speech, but the word carnage did capture the result of deindustrialization. But why did deindustrialization happen? It didn't happen because of the Mexicans or because of the Nicaraguans or the Greeks migrating into America. It happened because Wall Street effectively took over after 1971, the end of Bretton Woods, and it started recycling the rest of the world's capitalist profits. So, once America stopped being a producer of surplus goods, and being an industrial superpower as it was in the 1950s and 60s, for a number of reasons. The Vietnam War, the internal dynamics of the American capitalist economy led America to start having a trade deficit. And it was the decision of Richard Nixon and the people who followed Richard Nixon, people like Paul Volcker, who was the president of the Federal Reserve and so on, and the people in the Republican Party that now their descendants are applauding Trump, who decided, okay, we have a deficit. We're not going to be German. We're not going to tighten our belts. We're not going to introduce austerity. We're not going to do a George Osborne. What we're going to do is we're going to step on the accelerator and increase our deficits and make the rest of the world pay for them. So the rest, the German, Japanese manufacturers were producing cars and electronics and so on, sending them to the United States. The United States would pay with dollars. Then the German and Japanese capitalists, and then the Chinese capitalists as well, would send those dollars back to Wall Street. And what would Wall Street do with that? It would buy American debt, so the American government could be in perpetual increasing deficits and wouldn't matter. They would buy shares in American companies that subcontracted their manufacturing to Vietnam. And real estate. Thus, Donald Trump was born as a result of this model, which deindustrialized. So this is the great hypocrisy of people like Donald Trump. He's looking the working class of the United States in the eye and says, "Oh, I feel your pain," but their pain is exactly this. It's the output of exactly the same process that led to Donald Trump's real estate business success. Right? And in the end, of course, he's going to sell them down the line in the same way that Hitler led to the destruction of Germany. Because even if, let's say that Donald Trump's policy and J.D. Vance's policy of slapping tariffs on all the countries that export stuff to the United States works, and there is reindustrialization of America. I don't think there will be, but let's say there is. Then what happens immediately after that is that the flow of capital back to the United States stops, because the flow of capital into Wall Street from the rest of the world is the flip side of the same coin as the American trade deficit. Once you eliminate the trade deficit, there will be no more German profits, excess profits, or Japanese profits, or Chinese profits from the American market to go back to Wall Street. So who's going to suffer? Financiers in Wall Street and the realtors in New York. So Trump, even if he succeeds, he will have to choose between betraying his own class, the realtors and the financiers, or the working class of the United States. Make no mistake that he will betray the working class of the United States. Exactly the same way that every other ultra-rightist has betrayed the working class that it has appealed to for support in order to be authoritarian.
So Steve Bannon would agree with all of that up to a certain point, but then he would say, yes, Yanis, I agree with you. A certain interest was privileged over another, finance, real estate over industrial capital. We didn't think that mattered. Actually, it was a crucial part of the American body politic, our quote-unquote greatness in the world. Now we have Trump, and you're saying he's going to have to choose, because he's going to choose a very, very different way. Do you ever speak to people in the US about this stuff? Do you ever speak to somebody like Steve Bannon about how Trump will necessarily sell these people out, because there's literally no precedent for somebody from his class background, somebody peddling the interest that he does. There's literally no precedent with him reindustrializing a country in the way that they're talking about autarky, import substitution. Like this is, I mean, you never say never, but it's literally never happened before.
Can I confess something?
Please.
One of my great sorrows is that Steve Bannon has said very good things about my previous book, Technofeudalism. When you have
he's always using the word, right?
Yeah, well, yes, and he quotes me. It is terrible when a fascist takes seriously your book, and especially when Marxists hated my book. Not all of them, but most of them. But anyway, let's not talk about that book. Look, there was an occasion. Steve Bannon and I were meant to debate one another in 2019 prior to the European Parliament election, because he was here in Europe, organizing the ultra-right. But then at the last moment, he pulled out. No, I don't talk to these people. I would talk to them. I don't have a deep platforming agenda. I don't think they're really interested deeply in ideas and historically grounded analysis of what's going on. Steve Bannon is a very good propagandist from the fascistic American right-wing perspective. He would agree with a lot of what I said, that and he uses the concept of technofeudalism in order to attack people like Elon Musk, and to say that it's people like Elon Musk who are leading Trump astray. So the MAGA movement is in grave danger of failing, because people like Elon Musk are not allowing Trump to do that which his heart really wants to do, which is to reindustrialize America and so on and so forth. And then immediately he turns his ire, his venom against the migrants, because like a true fascist, he needs to blame it on the other, on the foreigner. He has no concept of capitalism. He's got no concept of the fact that as long as capital is owned by the very few, then whatever you do, there is going to be a tendency of the system, a systemic tendency for either an imbalance which creates large deficits that then require the exploitation of other nations in order to be covered, or large surpluses like the German economy or the Chinese economy produce, which then also require, in order to be balanced out, the exploitation of other markets. So in a sense, when Marx was arguing that capitalism has spawned a new form of imperialism, which is not the imperialism of, we want to conquer South America in order to steal their gold, like old-fashioned imperialism, but it is the kind of imperialism where, because capitalism produces from the same production line not only amazing goods, like iPhones and gadgets and so on, but also dearth of demand. Dearth of demand is one of the safest products of capitalism. Then, in order to cover for that, to plug that gap in demand, you need to conquer markets. and exploit those markets. And that is neo-imperialism, or the imperialism of the 20th century. And now we have new forms of imperialism through the new forms of capital that we have, like algorithmic capital or cloud capital. But you see people that, like Steve Bannon, they are propagandists. They don't care about the true workings of the machinery of capital accumulation. They just want power. This will to power, this Nietzschean, pseudo-Nietzschean, fascistic need to gather power and do things with it, create facts on the ground and be men and put the women back at home and, get rid of trans people and blame it all on the browner segments of the human race and pretend that there is no climate change. Because, if you accept that there is a climate catastrophe or emergency, then you have to be communist. Because, the atmosphere is a commons. It's the definition of a commons. And the moment you privatize it, you kill it.
The climate change thing is fascinating because more intelligent people on the right in recent years have started to say, well, climate change is real, but the climate's always changing. You have the sort of the Middle Ages of Europe were quite warm. The Roman Empire was quite warm. It's always up and down. Okay, so the climate is not stable. It's contingent on various factors. The argument is that man-made climate change means that we're going to see that kind of shift much more quickly with much sort of harsher overheads. And it's not an either or. Yeah, it's always changing. We had dry periods and mini ice ages and so on. That's all true, but it doesn't discount the fact that we're now living in a world which is we're now beginning to get to 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial period. That those things are both true. And what you said about the right not being interested in ideas is really interesting, Yanis, because I kind of agree. I do genuinely try and read as much as I can from people who are not just conservatives, but neo-reactionaries, because they have a critique of liberalism, which I always find really interesting, right? But they literally don't have an account of the economy, which is why they end up in these bizarre, pseudo-religious, hyper-irrational places. And you see that with the Nazis in the 20s and the 30s. You see it with Curtis Yarvin today, right? I try and read his stuff and I just think none of this makes any sense. Like, what are you talking about? I saw that former Fox lady, what's her name? She did the debates a few years ago, Megyn Kelly. And she was talking about Etsy curses being put on Charlie Kirk and how these curses are real and demons are real. And I'm thinking, you know what? I get it. If China is on the rise, if China's developing technologies you can't, if your people are increasingly polarized and, the public is fragmented in terms of what they want, what they believe in, if you're losing technological leadership as an Atlantic power for the first time in 400 or 500 years, it's shifting east. You can't make sense of any of that unless you're a historical materialist, I think. So they end up in the most crazy places, right?
They need to invoke satanic forces. They need to do that. But you said something before that I don't agree with, Aaron.
Please.
You said that the smart rightists who are approaching the question of the climate emergency are the ones who are accepting that there is climate change, but they reject the notion that there's causality between fossil fuels being burnt, for instance, primarily, and climate change. I don't think they're the smartest. I think these people can be easily disproved. The causal link has been statistically established, and you really need to simply not care about the science of statistics in order to dispute it. The clever rightists are the ones who agree that it is fossil fuels, it is the agriculture, that the way we do it, that causes climate emergency, but insist in a kind of evangelical way that the market that caused this problem is the mechanism, the divine mechanism, the invisible hand. By Adam Smith, he used that term in order to invoke the hand of God, right? So, and what is the hand of God? The forces of demand and supply that must be harnessed in a neoliberal way by creating new markets that didn't exist. Markets for emissions, trading schemes and all that, in order to defeat the climate emergency in the most efficient way humanity has ever discovered, and that is, what is the most efficient mechanism? It is the market. So this is the neoliberal mantra that is coming back to suggest that, okay, the markets failed, they're destroying the planet, now we have to create new markets that will save the planet.
But that's not a rightist position. That's like a centre-left position.
Well,
so when I say rightist, I mean kind of
see,
neo-reactionary.
Aaron, I don't make a distinction between
That's
the
like
center,
the PASOK
the center left
Labour
and the,
position.
Yeah, okay, but for me, these people are, they are expressing the interests of capital in a more lethal manner. Keir Starmer. Let's go to Keir Starmer. I don't think he even deserves us mentioning his name. But Tony Blair was the worst Tory prime minister Britain ever had.
Was he? Did he do more damage to this country than Margaret Thatcher?
Well, he completed her damage. He was essential in completing the damage that Margaret Thatcher made. Because you see, Thatcher privatized externally, wholesale privatization. She took the housing stock from council houses. 30% of houses were, when I moved to England in 1978, I remember 30% were council houses. So she essentially enriched those lucky enough to be allowed to buy those houses. I'm sure they loved it, and they had every reason to, but the result was the complete catastrophe that now young people, and not so young people, experience in the housing market is the result of that. She took British Gas. She had Price Coopers value it, and she sold it at half the evaluation, half of its market value. You are too young to remember. The ads were amazing by Saatchi and Saatchi. Tell Sid, in other words, tell Sid to become a spiv, that if you buy £1,000 worth of British Gas shares, then you can sell them tomorrow morning for 2,000. Why? Because the company was valued at half its actual market value. Okay, and people felt fantastic because suddenly, they could. I remember people were coming to me and say, "Look, will you use your quota to buy British Gas shares?" I remember I used to live in Norwich back then, and I said no because I wasn't going to participate in this racket. And they said, "Oh well, can you allow us to buy your share? And I will give you £500. We'll give you half the profits."
Secondary markets.
Yes, indeed, and it was
my
happening all the
God.
time. And so that's how the spivs became Thatcherites. And that's how the Sierra Man became shifted from the Labour Party to the Tory Party. It was a great success story, but that effectively depleted massive amounts of publicly owned capital, and essentially threw it into the mill of the financialization that the City of London was creating, and that was all wasted, including North Sea oil. All the proceeds were used in order effectively to fight a class war against the working class, with the miners' strike, with all that. And then Blair comes on. When Blair became prime minister, effectively everything had been solved already. So he does something more insidious than Thatcher. He takes the National Health Service, for instance, or the public school system, and starts, without formally privatizing them, the NHS remained public, but he starts an insipid internal privatization of all its functions, of its services, the subcontracting, the private-public initiatives. That was all doing what, essentially? Increasing the cost of running the NHS massively, adding new layers of managers, on behalf of private companies that had taken over the NHS, except the shell of the NHS, which remained public. He did the same thing with schools, the quasi-private academies, and so on. I'm sure that some of those schools are better as a result, but they exclude the working class. If you're working class, you can't send your kids there. In the same way that the council houses were privatized, some working class people benefit, but in the end, there are no houses for the working class, council houses for the working class. And this was the Labour Party that did it. And now we have a new Labour government, a new Blairite Labour government that is taking this further down the same road of turning what is left of public institutions in this country into empty shells where there is a cesspool of financialization within that increases the costs at taxpayers' expenses and reduces quality, reduces quantity, and eliminates the sense that the British people have that they're actually in control, or their state even is in control of the social economy of this country. So talking about Labour or PASOK in my country as left, centre-left, no. They are the worst part of the machinery of financialization and of turning our societies into neoliberal nightmares.
The thing about council houses is really interesting because it's such a big class signifier in this country, right? Oh, I mean, Sadiq Khan, who I don't dislike the guy. I wouldn't vote Labour. I don't dislike him. He's not the worst person in Labour by a long way. He would say, I grew up in a council house, or I lived in a council house. And I'm thinking, mate, I lived in London 15 years. I lived in a council house. It's just the difference is I paid £1,000 a month for it because it had been privatised in the 1980s. People don't live in council houses generally anymore because guess what? They don't exist. So that really, really bothers me. But I have a question. You mentioned Blair. You were going to talk about Starmer, so you weren't, engage in the indignity of mentioning. Yeah, but this is really interesting for me because I was going to ask you, do you think they know what they're doing? So, for instance, recently, Keir Starmer gave a speech and he said that we're getting all this investment from the US and Blackstone, this asset manager, is quote unquote investing, I can't remember, tens of billions of pounds, investing. Now, people who know what asset managers do know they're not investing. What they're doing is they're buying assets, clues in the name. They try and buy them cheap. They underinvest. They underpay. They squeeze as much revenue as they can, and then they try and sell them at a marked up price. So that's not investment. That's actually the complete opposite of investment. But do you think
they
Keir
suck
Starmer,
them dry?
Does Keir Starmer know that? Do you think?
Well, Tony Blair certainly did because he was a very smart man. He still is a very smart man. He's as evil as they come, but he's smart. I don't think there's much happening inside Keir Starmer's head. I have very serious doubts about his intelligence.
He was the director of public prosecutions.
Yeah, he was a terrible director of public prosecutions. He has left a terrible legacy. I have heard stories from within that he was one of the worst people to have run the CPS. And if you look at his record too, politically, as the director of the Crown Prosecution Service, you'll find that even on the basis of human rights and discrimination, it's not a record that he should be proud of. But in any case, look, I have no doubt he's a good lawyer. But that's a bit like an AI bot that knows to do one job well. So, you give him a brief, you say, this is what I want you to argue, and he's pretty good at putting together a case and arguing that brief. But as Prime Minister, he has to create a brief. And I don't think he has a clue of how to do that. It's clear. I mean, he's stumbling and falling on his face. And
you don't think he's a creative thinker?
I don't think he's a great thinker. His greatest asset was that he operated like a chameleon during the time of my friend Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party, and he managed to position himself as somebody that was loyal, that had the capacity to argue like a lawyer, and that he could bridge the two factions of the Labour Party. He could with the face of somebody resembling Tony Blair, he could pursue a radical manifesto as he had promised to do in 2019, to maintain the radical manifesto of Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. But within a year, he had ditched the 2019 manifesto. He had embraced, along with Rachel Reeves, the George Osborne mentality about fiscal prudence, and of course got rid out of, he expelled from the Labour Party. I mean, to think that he expelled Ken Loach for anti-Semitism. I mean, you only need to state that to realize that this man has never seen a moral void in which he didn't jump headlong.
Every once in a while, we like to take Downstream out of the studio. We do things IRL. We have public events. They can be powerful. They can be fun. They're always worth attending. We're doing one of those on October the 13th at Earth in Hackney, that's in London, to coincide with the publication of a really important book, Gaza, the Story of a Genocide. I'll be hosting, talking to some of the contributors to that book, I think an editor as well. Come along. The link is in the description below. Really good news. 50% of any profits we make from this event will go to medical aid for Palestinians. I think probably today the number one most worthwhile cause out there anywhere. So we're platforming great voices. We're sending cash to a really important cause. Click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. You know, I've got a really good friend of mine. He's half Italian, half Ecuadorian. His dad was a postman. And his mum used to work my mum used to have a sandwich shop. His mum used to work in the video shop over the road, you know, really working class background. And he's done really well. He's now a quantity surveyor. He lives in Qatar. He makes a ton of money, just makes tons of money. And he has this knack for like really good folksy wisdom. And he said this thing to me, which is just, it's how I now view Keir Starmer. He said, people like that can end up earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a year if they just do what they're told, they side with the powerful, and they turn to everything 15 minutes early. And that is 3/4 of the powerful bureaucrats you're ever going to meet in your life.
Exactly. I mean, that's
it's crazy to think that.
That's a smarter way of putting what I said earlier, that he's good at, you know, in pursuing a brief that is handed to him, but he cannot come up with one of his own. Look, compare and contrast him and Tony Blair. Tony Blair was a strategist. He was very good at creating his own objectives and strategizing in order to get them done, to achieve them. I disagreed with his objectives, and I disagreed with his means, especially his violation of international law and the resulting, you know, hundreds of thousands of deaths in Iraq. But he knew how to get things done. I don't think Keir Starmer can do that. You can see that he's flip-flopping. He doesn't even have his own agenda. And the worst aspect of it is that he's trying to appeal to people and to interests that will never find him appealing. And he keeps rubbishing the people that should be the natural constituency of the Labour Party.
How long do you think he'll be Prime Minister for? I know these are foolish questions, Yanis, but
I have no idea, Aaron. It just reminded me of Keynes's expression that, the market can stay rational for longer than I can stay solvent or alive. So, this political system with the great majority he has, it depends on the parliamentary Labour Party. If they see that their survival chances are not improving as a result of Keir Starmer's performance, they'll probably get rid of him and replace him in the same way that the Tories kept changing one prime minister after the other.
I mean, there was one poll that put them on 16%, right? And I think the Greens were on 12%.
I don't understand who amongst those 16% would have confidence in such a man. I find it an extraordinarily high percentage.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very high, 16%.
Well, maybe in a proportional system.
16% of the population who still trust Keir Starmer, amazes me.
Yeah. I think he'll go next May, but you're right. I mean, it all depends on him. But I was speaking to Tom McTague recently. He wrote this fantastic book about Euroscepticism. Really, really fantastic book. And he said there's a core contradiction. Sometimes somebody says something to me, just clarifies so much. He said there's a core contradiction with Blair, which is that he wants modernization. Be more like the EU, be more like the US, freedom of information, PR for elections, join the Eurozone, be pro-Europe, big tech, loves modernization, right? And on the other hand, his electoral strategy is try and win over the people who hate, quote unquote, modernization the most, right? So that's your sort of political economic project, and then that's your electoral project. Obviously, it's going to blow up. And what's crazy is, and that's why you get reform. That's why you get Brexit. Like that explains all of it, right? And then you see Keir Starmer in 2025 doing the exact same thing. And I wonder where it ends. And it's so catastrophic as a strategy and so stupid and misguided. And he doesn't realise what he's doing. I think obviously it ends in a reform government. If this carries on, and it might not carry on. Obviously it ends in a reform government. But I think, it could be genuinely the end of the UK. If this is now how the Labour Party governs, if you're a Scottish Social Democrat or a Welsh Social Democrat, what are you thinking? Like this is not a sensible way to govern a country. Do you think that reform could be in power at the next election? And if they are, what are the consequences for the union?
Well, allow me to take a bird's eye view of Britain in the last 30 years. In answering your question, Thatcher sold the lie of the free market revolution. There was nothing. There was no free market there. It was an oligopolistic market that she created. She created cartels in the name of the free market. But she managed to bribe a large segment, large enough under the first past the post. You don't need to have a majority. You need to get 35%. So she managed to lure into her project a number of formerly working class people, petty bourgeois people, because essentially she liquidated a lot of public capital through, we had this discussion, the privatization of houses, of companies and so on. Tony Blair did the same thing with this insidious quasi-privatization of existing public institutions, effectively turning the British state, universities, schools, planning departments, turning them over to the private sector, to the consultants, to the class of consultants and consultancy firms, to the Ernst & Youngs and so on and so forth. So that was also a form of liquidating public capital and bribing a part of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie. Now, poor Starmer, after another, 14 years of Tory rule, after the Blair-Brown government, who effectively sold what was remaining of the family silver down the road, there's nothing left to liquidate. So he's trying to stay on the track of Thatcherism, Blairism, of trying to, be kind to the grand liberal project or stay faithful to it, while at the same time arresting the outflow of voters from, the north of England, from Clacton, from the various areas that are now totally reform-minded. And he just can't do it. He just doesn't have the money, the capital to liquidate, to bribe them, and he doesn't have the narrative. And he's trying to win over people that have been lured by the xenophobia of reform, the quasi-fascist, neo-fascist, proto-fascist, call it whatever you might, xenophobia of reform, through racism light. Essentially, I am going to be the one who stops the boats, as if the problem of Britain are the people who are coming to these shores on small boats. It is not the problem of Britain. There are other problems. So he's presenting himself as the more efficient racist who has a lighter touch, therefore he's a bit kinder, a bit more liberal. That doesn't win over the liberals and doesn't win over the racists. So, liberalism light doesn't mix well with racism light, especially when you don't have public capital to liquidate and bribe people. And, at the same time, the Labour Party, since Blair, with the approval of people like Keir Starmer, has lost the capacity to talk to the working class, has lost the capacity to talk about exploitation. It doesn't want to talk about exploitation. I mean, in the Labour Party conference the other day, right? I mean, they were hosting sponsors events with, the large corporations, trying to convince them that they are better stewards of their cartel-like markets. You can't have these events while at the same time convincing the working class that you don't treat them like, what was it that Hillary Clinton described them? Like deplorables. And they are then presented, gift-wrapped, to Nigel Farage's reform.
Liz Kendall, I think it was Liz Kendall, is at Labour conference yesterday, or was it today? And she's talking about sisters in big tech. Now, I know you're a feminist. I know, Yanis, and the book is anchored around 5 women in your life. But I'm thinking this is a lady who lives in a very, very expensive penthouse in central London with her financier partner. The taxpayer funds her heating bill, and she's talking about sisters in big tech. And I just think, like you say, it's almost a miracle they're on 16%. I mean, it's like watching something from 15 years. It's like watching a US Netflix series from 15 years ago. They have no idea what is happening in terms of where people are going politically, in terms of their economic experience of life. A few things.
But, it's not feminism to campaign for gender balance amongst the CIA torturers. or in big tech. That's not feminism. Feminism is about liberation. It used to be. That's what my mom taught me. That's what her mom, that's what my dad's mom taught me through her writings, her letters, and so on. Feminism is about liberation. Once upon a time, it was called Women's Lib, remember? It was all about liberating, not just women, but also men, from the urge to be patriarchal, because as Hegel taught those of us who of a left-wing disposition in the master-slave paradox, the master can never be free as long as he fears a slave, and he must fear the slave if he needs to be the master. So in the end, the critique of people like Karl Marx of capitalism is that we all become servants of the machinery in the end, whether we are proletarians or capitalists, whether we are, manosphere blokes or, terrorized women or trans people. We are all in the end subject to the terror of forces beyond our control. So feminism should be about liberating people from capital, including big tech capital.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad.
You don't look convinced.
No. It's really sad. No, because you talk about being a feminist in the book, and there's lots of people now. There are lots of men who are feminists who would be like, I would never be a feminist. And you think, well, women couldn't have a credit card in this country till 1975. Was that a bad thing? Yeah, that's bad. It shouldn't be. Okay, should a woman have a right to abortion? Of course they should. Should they have a right to divorce? Yeah, of course they should.
That's all the result of feminism.
Well, quite. And these are
my grandma.
And now that's about big tech.
The Egyptian Feminist Union in 1923. I'm ever so proud. Look, I don't think that we men can claim to be I describe myself as a feminist. Maybe women feminists and some more radical feminists are right that feminism needs to be lived through the experience of womanhood. Maybe they are right in this. But we boys, the members of the defective sex, we need to understand that, keeping the woman in the house is a form of oppressing ourselves too. It goes against our capacities, our nature. Keeping somebody under your thumb in the end enslaves you. And this is not a utopian kind of airy-fairy thing. I think that there is so much evidence of the diminution in the quality of life of those who spend all their life oppressing others. I don't think that the people now who are in the IDF in Palestine, killing thousands and thousands and thousands, participating in the genocide, I don't think they will have a good life when they go back home once this awful situation ends at some point. In the same way that the Vietnam War veterans went back to the United States and estranged from their own society, and they ended up with massive, percentages of drug abuse, of early deaths, of suicide. Oppressing is not what it's cracked up to be.
Well, there's a reason Netanyahu's son's not there, right? I presume he'd like to keep all his arms and legs and not get PTSD.
Like George W. Bush.
Yeah. I mean, I saw a great clip, actually, speaking of this quickly. I saw a great clip the other day of IDF veteran, and he was crying, speaking to some kind of, I don't know, like some sort of panel, because he hadn't got disability benefits. Mm-hmm. And he said, I killed 40 people for you. And he's saying it. So he was in the Golani Brigade, I think it's called. I killed 40 people for you. I shit myself. I have nightmares. And my mother is paying for my hospital bills. And I think, fuck, man.
That's like the Vietnam War veterans and the Iraq War veterans. They use them, and then they throw them out like fodder that has lost its market value.
You shoot kids, and then you end up shitting yourself, and the people that told you to shoot the kids won't look after you.
I use this as an extreme,
of course,
but nevertheless helpful example of how this idea of the manosphere is highly oppressive for boys. Because, if you're a 12-year-old, 13-year-old adolescent boy, and you are part of that environment, and you feel that you need to conform to the macho image, or to the image of a boy that thinks very little of women and wants to, treat them like second-rate humans, and at some point, marry one of them and keep them in the home to have babies for the nation. that is, besides being abhorrent for women, it is abhorrent for the soul of that young 12, 13-year-old boy, putting him in that position. So feminism was always about liberating both men and women, in the same way that the socialist revolution should be about not only liberating the working class, but also liberating the capitalist class.
Andre Gause is really good on this. He talks about feminism and the French thinker. He was really good on how feminism allowed men to love their children properly.
Well, this is why I wrote this book.
Yeah.
Literally. Because, I owe it to these 5 women that they have liberated me from the male chauvinist pig within me.
I don't believe that, Yanis. I think you were born enlightened, highly intelligent man.
No, I was socialized through misogyny, like most boys. I still remember, as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, that our socialization process as boys revolved around hating girls and treating them like shit.
Do you think that's got better?
No, I don't. I think it's getting worse.
Did it get better?
It did get better, and now it's getting worse. Look at adolescence, right? I know that this has become a kind of stereotype, but I think it's quite telling. I see this from our kids. It is definitely getting worse.
Why?
Well, because we have the drift to the ultra-right. Allow me a bit of economic determinism, and a bit,
please,
revealing my Marxism, my unreconstructed Marxism. I think that 2008 was our generation's 1929. And ever since we had our generation in 1929, the left failed to put forward a liberating, emancipatory narrative. Even when we did get into government, like I did, we failed. It doesn't matter why. We fought with one another. There was betrayal, there was treachery, there was stupidity and mistakes and so on. And just like in the mid-war period, in the 1920s and 1930s, after the left fails, discontent grows. And then the idea of the masculine, patriarchal rebirth of the nation, which goes hand in hand with the patriarchal family around the patriarch, the paterfamilias. This whole thing becomes a political agenda that is functional to the interests of the cartel running big business. Don't forget that big capital always in the end gets into bed with the fascists, and this patriarchal narrative becomes even more reinforced. So, if you are looking at it from this macroscopic and macro-sociological point of view, then you realize why it all clicks. You have stagnation, you have no investment in good quality jobs or green energy, you have the decline of feminism, you have the rise of hating the other, whether the other is the trans, the Muslim, the Jew, the Greek, the Irishman or woman, whatever. There is a tsunami of regressive ideas. Effectively, the Dark Ages are engulfing us. And the only way of fighting this is by us leftists, firstly, looking ourselves in the mirror and being exceptionally critical of our own failures and our own incapacity to unite and to find common ground, because the fascists are really very good at being solidaristic with one another. Whereas we leftists, you put two of us in one room, you end up with 3 factions or 4. And to resist. As a Palestinian said recently to me, for us Palestinians, existence is resistance. And I think the rest of us will need to appropriate that slogan.
See, I agree with the economic argument. And that runs through this book, that runs through your other books, that we're kind of going through, not one for one, but we're going through something quite similar, clearly, to the interwar period, right? I agree with all that, but I find it interesting that you're somebody who is a good comrade, good Marxist. You think technology is very determinative of things, not entirely, but very determinative of things. You talk about techno-feudalism. And I look at the rise of the manosphere and the sort of reactionary right amongst young boys, and I can't help but think of pornography. I can't help but think of how you've got this triad of social media, smartphones, the attention economy, ubiquitous porn, of course young kids are going to think about women differently. Of course they are. You know, it was only 15 years ago in this country, we had a campaign against page 3 in The Sun. You know, it's quaint. Now you've got kids, 9, 10, 11-year-old boys able to, well, fortunately not actually, because the government's kind of changed it, but you can get VPNs or whatever, being able to access pornography. Or, you know, you've got Bonnie Blue, you know, OnlyFans, gangbangs with 1,000 blokes. And that's where it integrates with the social media and the attention economy, because her revenue model is to get maximum attention on social networks where loads of kids
Well,
are.
I write a lot about this in my Techno
Well, quite.
book,
So
because we have a new form of capital that trains us to train it, to train us to train it, to modify our behavior. And anyone who owns that capital, whether they use it to sell stuff through Amazon or Uber or through pornography, has enhanced power over the rest of us who do not own that capital. But what you're saying is completely consistent with my worldview.
No, I know it is. But the thing is, so somebody like Jonathan Haidt would say all of this, right? He would say kids shouldn't have smartphones, social media before 14, 16, get phones out of schools, which is happening. You know, I personally would prohibit pornography. I don't know how you do it. I would digital pornography, I would. If you want to, we've got magazines, get a DVD, but you have to have some kind of prohibition, that ease of access. For anybody under 18, you have to have some kind of, and I know we've kind of half done it, but the idea of a young teenager being able to access that stuff for zero cost, I think is responsible for so much bad stuff. And I can't help think of my grandmother, my Iranian grandmother. My dad comes to this country in 1976, I think, to study engineering at Southampton University. And, you know, she's a Jewish woman, but she's Iranian. She was traditional, but she would have looked at the West as progress, enlightenment. They allow people to live more free lives. And I think now, if she was still alive, she died age 98 in 2023. I think now, if she saw Bonnie Blue, if she saw what kids are doing to each other with regards to social media, like bullying, if she saw OnlyFans, and I sound like some arch reactionary, she would look at that and think, what is going on in that country? You know, she would say to her son, why are you there? Why would you want grandchildren there? And she wasn't like a reactionary or conservative woman. She would just view that as being really at odds with freedom and liberty and progress and enlightenment. And I feel like the left's given it a bit of a free pass, if I'm honest, actually.
Well, I don't disagree that some curbs are important and some good can be done. But I disagree that the problem will be solved through regulating. No, as I said, so I'm not against what you're proposing. I would go a bit further, actually. I would say that the idea of anonymity in the internet and of free goodies, not just pornography, but anything, is inimical to the species' interest, because there's no such thing as a free good. With cloud capital, effectively we're training the machines to train us to give somebody power over us. So in a science fiction novel that I wrote a few years ago, and others now, I outlined how in my utopian socialist, democratic, liberal, whatever society, communist, everything would, firstly, it wouldn't be anonymous. Secondly, you would have complete ownership of all your data. And thirdly, you would have to pay for every service eponymously. So if you did that, then you would have a lot more degrees of freedom as society to control this reinforcement mechanism, because cloud algorithms, cloud capital, reinforces existing misogyny, for instance. Everything you describe, what we see, the way boys excite one another, and through the algorithm and through OnlyFans and through pornography, turn effectively super misogynistic in their approach to sex. That was always there even before the algorithm, but it has been turbocharged. I agree with you. But the solution can't be just curbs, just regulations by which to curtail. You need to change the ownership structure. This is where Marxism comes in. You see, so why is it that you have OnlyFans? Because the people who create OnlyFans make billions. billions out of this capacity to use the machinery and whatever imagery is reinforced by the machinery in order to capture eyeballs and then sell those eyeballs to particular interests, sell their data, sell their information and so on. Now, why are some people like me, and maybe you, Marxists? Because we believe that what really matters in the end is who owns the machines and whether these machines are socially owned. So I'm a socialist because I believe that all machinery should be socially owned. And pornography, it would never go away because there are parts of our sexual makeup which I think cannot be fully civilized. Allow me to put it in those terms.
Freudian, goes that.
Yeah, I mean, it's beyond the rational, it's beyond the moral. I don't claim to understand the darker aspects of our sexuality. So there will always be. But what you want to prevent is this reinforcement mechanism, feedback mechanism between ownership of machines and the darker aspects of our sexuality.
So, I mean, I was somebody who really heavily endorsed like free culture 15 years ago, and I still do, it's really, and P2P and all that stuff, I really think it's a big deal. And that talk about, lost alternative modernities, that was one of them. But I do think that allow me to be like an Adam Smith, disciple. I do feel like if you just said, okay, this is going to cost £5. If you just applied the price mechanism to this stuff, 95. I agree with you. That's much better than a prohibition. 95% of people, they wouldn't bother. They'd say, okay, there's the marginal utility from this, or I'd spend £5. They would make a market decision through the price mechanism that it's not worth it. The problem is that it's free, and you can access it anytime, any place. So in that way, it's almost a supernatural good, right? It's not subject to scarcity. It's not subject to location. It's just an incredible thing. But
is it very different?
It's wiring the most primal, powerful parts of our brain.
To news feeds being free, which then create fiefdoms like
same
Google.
Spectrum, right?
And then once you have the fiefdom of news dissemination from Google or from Meta, Facebook, then what happens is news agencies and news corporations, and not corporations, but you know what I mean, news producers end up being vassalized by these digital behemoths. And then when that happens, newspapers shut down, or they become utterly dependent on these big tech companies, which then use, like Elon Musk and Zuckerberg and so on, use that monopoly, the fiefdom they've created, in order totally to poison any possibility of democratic debate and news dissemination. I think that whether you're talking about news or sexual images for the edification of the viewer, it is the private ownership and the highly concentrated ownership of the machinery that toxifies our societies, whether it is our democracies or, our sexuality.
I agree with all of that, but I do think we're talking about things the right has done well and the left has failed to do. I do think in the last 15 years, the left has just failed to say to people, you know what, these are the things you need to live a good life. We've failed to offer that normative framework, which all humans ever, over the last 300,000 years, and other primates too probably before them, archaic humans.
I agree.
They need that.
I agree.
And I think the left, and in this book, it talks effectively about your moral foundation, and that's why I think it's such a it's a great read. I really enjoyed it. But I do feel like the left has said, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're not going to tell you what a good life looks like. We're not going to sort of say how you should live. And you've got somebody like Jordan Peterson who says something so basic as clean your room, and all of a sudden it's that, which I'm being stupid here because it's a stupid thing to say, but all of a sudden that can be passed as cod wisdom, because actually young people have very few people in their lives telling them what a good life is. And, I, as a Marxist, as a historical materialist, I think we're really missing a trick, because actually we have the unique explanations as to why so much is happening.
If Peterson can find ways that I can utilize to convince my daughter to clean her room, maybe I will become one of his disciples.
How old is she?
21.
But you're a product of the Enlightenment. Your parents were scientists.
Yeah.
They come from very humble beginnings. I find this really funny. You were going to study physics.
Indeed.
And you were persuaded by Papandreou
That's correct.
to become a mathematical economist.
Yes.
Let's do this story because it's quite funny. How come you're an economist and your parents are scientists?
Initially, I wanted to be a pianist, but then I realized I didn't have what it takes to be a good one. And then I decided I'm going to go into theoretical physics, not experimental physics. No, I didn't want to get my hands dirty. I wanted theory. At some point, I had the opportunity of, when I was applying for university places here in this country, filling my ACA forms and all that, they asked for a kind of academic reference. And there was this opportunity that the leader of the opposition at the time, who was an academic economist back in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, Andreas Papandreou, and later he was one of the most successful Greek prime ministers in the 1980s and early 90s, mid-90s. He could give me a reference, and he was a very substantial person in my pantheon of important people at the time in the mid-70s. So somebody organized this. Of course, he didn't know who I was, and he was simply going to sign a reference letter that his secretary would produce, which is exactly what happened. And I was asked to go into his office and collect it from his secretary in the House of Parliament in Greece when he was leader of the opposition. So I go in there, I sit down. I was waiting for the secretary to prepare the letters and to give it to me. Apparently it was signed. She was putting it in an envelope. And at that time, the great man walks by and he realized I was waiting for something. And he said, "Well, come to my office." And he was very chatty, very pleasant. And he knew nothing about it. He said, "Why are you here?" Reference later. "Oh, okay, yeah, I know nothing about it." He didn't even ask me for my name. He said, "What do you want to study?" I said, "Theoretical physics at Imperial College. This is what I'm applying for." He said, "No, you won't do that. You'll do mathematical economics at the University of Essex." And I was absolutely incensed. He knew nothing about me. He didn't know my name, who I was, what I was good at, what I wasn't good at. But he had an opinion, not only that I shouldn't study theoretical physics and what I should study, mathematical economics, but also which university at. And then he started explaining, and it made perfect sense. He said, "Look, for you to be part of this political party," I was an activist in the Socialist Party at the time, "you must be political. So you shouldn't study theoretical physics because nobody takes physicists seriously when they talk politics. Economists they do take seriously. And you should do mathematical economics because it's the nearest to theoretical physics. It's exactly the same mathematics, but instead of having on the x-axis and the y-axis, having, temperature, energy, and heat and all that, you have inflation, unemployment, investment. But the mathematics is the same. So if you care about the maths, because this is what theoretical physics is, do mathematical economics so that when you open your mouth and you talk about politics, people can take you seriously." And then he also explained, "Don't go to the LSE, don't go." Imperial didn't have economics back then. I don't think it does. Maybe it does now, I don't know. He said, "You should go to Essex because it's a very progressive university and there are 2 or 3 very good mathematical economists. I know them personally." I ended up going to Essex, to the Red University, to study mathematical economics.
It was it still is, but at the time it was very left-wing political.
Back then, I was part of the Communist Party and the ComSoc. And we had 4 of the 5 members of the executive of the Students' Union, communists. And there was 1 Labourite. Different time.
You could have been Carlo Rovelli. You could have been like a superstar European, another Penguin writer, talking about black holes and whatnot, but instead you're...
I don't know how good I would have been as a physicist.
We were a good communicator.
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed physics. I did study a little bit of physics. And then, I managed to escape economics. At some point, I ditched all the economics courses. I only did maths with a bit of theoretical physics. And my master's was in mathematical statistics, nothing to do with economics. So I thought I had escaped economics until when I was in Birmingham, which is where I was doing my master's, I came across an article written by an MIT economist, highly mathematical article, which claimed in the abstract that he had proved that trades unions are stupid and capitalist employers are smart. And he had a mathematical model of how they negotiate, the capitalist employer and the trades union representing the workers. It was fully fledged optimization model, all singing, all dancing, double integrals and all that. And then he had a statistical section. He had actually gathered data from American negotiations between conglomerates and trade unions. And he claimed that through very sophisticated econometric work, statistical work, that he proved that his model was correct. And the model assumed that employers are super smart computers of net for future profits, and the unions were dumb resistors. And I thought, okay, that can't work. That can't possibly be true, but I need to find the chink in the armor of this article. So I spent 3 months debunking it, and the rest is history, because that became a thesis, and then it was published as a quite successful, quite impactful economic article. And then I started getting offers for lectureships in economics. I became an economist as a result.
Just because one guy pissed you off. And that's why you're here,
Yeah,
not Carlo Rovelli.
That's right.
But to go back to my point about being a product of the Enlightenment, that's a really impressive CV, right? You're talking about, I mean, I don't know why I was nodding just then. I've never read an academic paper with integers. You've got physics, pianist, mathematical economist.
Well, failed at all of those.
Statistical.
Failed physicist, failed pianist.
A politician.
Failed politician.
Writer. You're definitely a good writer. There's lots of good books you've written. So the point is that, you are a product of the Enlightenment. And I do sort of think that highly intelligent people from a progressive background who, are immersed in Enlightenment thinking, they just sort of presume that people don't need quite rigid, strong rules. I know you're not. I'm not saying you think that.
I don't think that.
But I think lots of people. I think lots of people do. Like my mum was a Catholic. She would say, and she'd be quite open about it. She'd say, "I'm one of those people in life. I need rules. I just need rules. I can't kind of live without it."
Yeah, Wittgenstein put it beautifully.
Please.
I mean, what's chess? Chess is a set of rules. It is the constraints that you can't take, a pawn and do whatever you want with it. There are certain rules, what you do with each of the pieces on a chessboard. Those constraints create a whole universe of chess, which liberate the mind. So constraints liberate. The question is, who chooses the constraints? Are these constraints placed upon you by somebody who has exorbitant power and can make you do things for them without you being an agent? So being a socialist is not being against rules.
Or quite.
Being a socialist is all about the collective decision-making process leading to rules that make for a good life and a universe like chess, which liberates the mind.
Which takes us to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. One might even argue the Chinese Communist Party.
Indeed.
I mean, this idea that freedom is acting without any inhibitions whatsoever is, it goes to John Locke, it goes to Hobbes, and it's the heart of, I think, some of the ultra-liberal problems we're facing today. I mean, we're not having a conversation about the history of ideas, but I think that's a beautiful analogy from Wittgenstein. I didn't know that, about constraints. Freedom is impossible without constraints.
Indeed.
Hegel talks about it like...
Indeed, but if you think about the mindset of economists, the people who run the Treasury here in Britain, the people who run the Bank of England, they have a model of homo economicus. At the heart of all those models that forecast, inflation, unemployment, this, that, and the others, the stock exchange, growth rates, all that, right? At the heart, they have a model of homo economicus, the rational economic man, and it is a man. Because if you read the model, it can't be a woman. It's so stupid; it cannot possibly be female. It's a humanoid who loves what he does and does what he loves, and the only thing he cares about is to maximize his satisfaction given his constraints. So his constraints are the only impediment to his freedom. So he cannot understand the point you made and the point that Wittgenstein made, that constraints liberate, because he's too dumb to have a capacity to judge his objectives, his preferences, his passions. For me, and I think that that is the case for the ancient Greek Enlightenment and also for the French Enlightenment, not so much the Scottish Enlightenment. That's where I part ways, but that's why I think that the Anglo-Celtic philosophical tradition, even though it's very interesting and noteworthy, it has led us down towards the path that eventuated in neoliberalism. original enlightenment, the continental enlightenment, is all about rationality as a mechanism by which we can ask ourselves the difficult question, which is, okay, I want X. Should I want X? To judge our preferences, to judge our passions. That's what differentiates us from machines or from stupid, insects. All animals want something. They have a desire for something. But we are the only animal that have a capacity to ask the question, okay, I want X. Should I want X? And by what criteria should I judge whether I want X? And as a society, we want that. Do we want that? Have we found out ways of synthesizing our individual desires into a collective will? These are the big questions which the right never answers. They assume that there is such a thing as a national interest, which coincides with the interests of the rich, of the powerful, of the capitalists. And this is where we leftists have to come in and to deconstruct it.
See, I think you've just beautifully explained there why we need, on the left, a project of a normative ethics, which we simply don't have.
Do.
Well, no, of course we do. But, the centre left, the progressive left, has, I think, in many ways over the last 20 years, just descended into just ultra-liberalism, do what you want. And I do think that's a good critique of it. And I think the left, and that is not, as you've said, that is not...
That's not the left from which I hail. I mean,
I know, but that's
these women in the book that I just wrote would be besides themselves with fury if you told them that, what we need to do is just have absolutely, it's relativism. That anything goes.
Many people associate the modern left with just supreme moral and cultural relativism. They do.
Well, in that case, it's not the left we're talking about. We're talking about some kind of mutation of what used to be left, which in the end falls into a postmodern melange of just idiotic urges. This is not what I am a true believer in the notion that, every baby that is born has certain talents, certain capacities, and that virtue and happiness, genuine happiness, a successful life, results only when these talents are realized. But for those talents to be realized, you need to invest in it. If you can become the best violinist or pianist in the world, right, you have to do the hard work of getting there. And if you have the capacity to play the piano like a dream, like a magician, a man or woman, then you can only be genuinely happy and fulfilled if you get to that point. But you're not going to get to that point if you simply follow the path of least resistance.
Yanis, you need to write this book. the rules to living. That can be the next one. Penguin can have that one for free. Let's have this last question, because we say in English, blown smoke up your backside, and I will happily do that because I think you're a terrific man. I think you're a huge asset on the left. We don't have enough people like you.
Thank you.
With your wisdom
you are making me blush.
Take the camera off, Yanis. With your wisdom and experience and humility, all really, really valuable. And you've succeeded in so many aspects of your life. You say at the top of this book that, this was written in response to 3 political failures in 1 year. You were kind of depressed almost. Quickly, what happened in that year? What were these failures?
Well, to begin with, it was a time of war. I didn't expect to have a European war north of my home in the Ukraine. It was a time when a genocide was brewing. These were things that I didn't expect to have to live through again in my 60s. In addition to that, our political party that entered parliament in 2019, you have this experience here, a new left-wing progressive force trying to get ahead. We managed to get into parliament. We elected 9 members of parliament. Into 2023, we had high hopes in the end because of high levels of abstention amongst the young who liked us but didn't go to vote. We crashed out of parliament. We lost our seats. And it was a twin election because there was a hung parliament. And so a month later, we had a second one. And of course, the media had a ball vilifying us and demonizing us because the media belonged to the oligarchs and the cartels that we waged war against. So that was a second failure within a month. And then it was a matter of not allowing a small party, but powerful, but I think quite significant one, nevertheless, for giving voice to the voiceless, to dissolve. Because, when you lose like that, it's really very easy to turn inwards. And so we tried very hard to do that. At some point, I was physically attacked by henchmen. I can't prove exactly who was behind that, but it wasn't so much, my injury. It was watching my wife and my comrades. It happened at a restaurant with 20.
It was serious. I mean, the
party
pictures were really, really serious.
I was hospitalized, but that wasn't the point. The point was that my own people, in my eyes, looked so helpless. So if you put all this together, somehow, for the first time in my life, I entered a period of depression, only for about a month or two. And then I decided I'm going to react to that. And this is why I wrote this book. Because, I remembered my mother, who had died in 2008, at difficult junctures, in difficult moments, saying to me, come on, raise your soul now. And there was a story to this, which had to do with prisons, my father being in prison, my uncle being in prison, and so on. And I thought, well, these people had gone through far, far worse than what I'm going through. And I'm going to write her story. So I started writing this book as a story of my mother. But then I added another 4 women because I realized that there was a lot more to say and that I could tell my story of the period between 1923 and 2024 through the eyes and perspectives of these women. So 10 pages into writing this book, suddenly the veil of depression was lifted.
And writing it, what did it tell you about what you'd gotten wrong in the last 15 years? So obviously you've suffered political defeats, personally, collectively. This process, did it make you sort of more critical about what you'd done? Did you begin to appraise yourself as a politician differently? So I could have done this, I should have done this, because you're going through these other people's lives and obviously they've made mistakes, they've had successes.
I try constantly to cast a critical light on what I do. I think only fanatics don't do that. You have to keep doing this. So what was special about the period of writing this book in terms of this self-critical process is that it wasn't so much me asking the question, what did I do wrong? I relived the lives of my mother, of my grandmothers, and so on, and managed to look at myself, not from a bird's eye point of view, but through their eyes. So I managed to bring them back to life in my head, in my soul, and to be critical of me the way they would be critical of me. And that was helpful.
Yanis, it's been a great conversation. It's a great book.
Thank you so much.
It's a fabulous book.
Thank you, Novara.
We'll have you back on soon. Thanks so much again.
Thank you.